Today we descend into the Yewdeep's past, where the light does more than illuminate. Tyd Shel is a mortal who has found safety there, a refuge from having once been used. He works carefully, shaping light for a system that values balance and stability above all else. A sap-light did not betray its failing with darkness. It failed first by becoming honest about what it was. Tyd always felt it before he saw it, a change in the passages when the illumination faltered. The Yewdeep held its balance by agreements made long ago, and when a light drifted too low or dulled too far, both he and his home noticed. Even the sap-lights that remain healthy hung with a more attentive stillness, listening and silently reporting. He stood beneath the failing orb and let his hands hover over it, a habit formed from years of learning that what looked like a simple globe of sap could behave quite differently if handled carelessly. The light had been settled in a watching chamber, one of the older ones where the overhead root still just managed to hold the space open. The orb floated at shoulder height now, much lower than it should, and its glow had dimmed into a tired core. Within it, the seraphal fire belly was curled in a small, warm knot. Tyd learned to first wait for calm and tranquility within himself before continuing. A man who had once been made into a corridor himself did not rush toward anything that might become a doorway, however familiar it may be. He took the bone blade from his belt, a curve of polished ivory shaped to part the sap without tearing it. He held the blade's edge close to the orb until the skin responded with its customary resistance, the kind of living thing offered when it preferred not to be opened. The fire-belly's eyes opened. They were dark, seed black, and fixed on him with a steady attention. It was neither pet nor prisoner. It was a presence cultivated for steadiness, and he felt its awareness as a simple acknowledgement that it was seen. He found the join by touch, a faint line in the orb where old repairs had been made in the past. The blade slid in and opened it silently, and he inserted 2 fingers, being careful not to press or show the orb any impatience. The inner membrane had clouded, which was the kind of fault that came from age. It could be scraped away, and he had done that in his earliest seasons there, when his hands still shook and he thought force was speed. It had ended badly more than once because the sap had responded to violence with violence, and the sprites had dimmed in a way that never recovered. Now he worked by persuasion. He uncorked a vial with his teeth and tipped 3 drops onto his fingertip. The liquid stung its skin a little, but he pressed it against the clouded membrane and held still until the sap remembered itself. It loosened slowly until he was able to lift the clouded strip in one careful draw, like pulling a splinter from flesh. The seraphal fire belly unfurled and its belly glow deepened. The orb's light in turn brightened enough to lay clean shadows along the walls. Tyd sealed the drawing with the flat of his palm, warming the sap until it closed, then watched the orb rise by itself to a proper height. He always thought of them as being merely tired and now remembering their duty anew. He got satisfaction for a moment, but then the old awareness returned, and that never let him enjoy anything without asking what it cost. A figure stood at the chamber's mouth. Reich's presence was always sudden. He stood there and inspected the repaired orb and then spoke to Tyd, 2 rootkin at his back. Tyd just waited, as he had learned to do since length, and the days in that city when waiting had been the only way to know whether the next movement would be his. "That is renewed," Tyd said. Reich's eyes stayed on the orb. "Good." Silence came after that, and the repaired orb floated between them like a patient witness. Reich broke the silence. "They've asked for more." "Who?" "The rootkin. New roots, deeper use." Tyd looked at the orb and felt that awareness again. the sprite within it touching the system and meeting the Yew's consciousness. It was always watching, which was why the light mattered. Reich continued, "Your output last season was useful." The word slipped into Tyd like a hook finding an old scar. "If it's only light you want, torches would do." Reich frowned. "Torches do not persist and are hazardous, as well you know." Reich had not raised his voice. He was simply stating what the Yewdeep and everyone in it already knew. "The Skogs have the brood ready," Reich added. Tyd wanted to say no, but it was a refusal that came as instinct, the same instinct that had once tried to shut his mouth when that wretched demon spoke through it. But he had learned in the Yewdeep that you could refuse a task, but the task would still exist and pass into less skilled hands. "I'll take them," he said. Reich nodded again. "Maintain the Elder Ones as you have been." "You'll replace them if I don't," Kid replied. Reich remained ever unreadable. "The system cannot be allowed to weaken Shel. That is the way of things in the Yewdeep." And there it was again, Reich's calm preference for function over feeling. Tyd thought it must be a Kaltarian peculiarity. Reich turned away, and the rootkin following him moved in unison with a creak of twig and fibre. Then they left, the passage swallowing them into the distance. Tyd's workshop lay along a passage that stayed drier than most, which was a practical mercy in a place that loved damp. The chamber had been grown for hands and tools, its walls smoother, its floor level, and a shallow trough carved into one side where sap could be warmed and mixed. He had arranged his implements by memory: bone rods, stone bowls, root silk cloths, and the curved bone blade he had just used. He kept it all simple, because ornament had once been used against him in length. A charm hung above a door that had been meant to ward evil had instead become a boundary the demon laughed at. He had never trusted decorations since. When the rootkin arrived with the sprites, they carried them in a shallow bowl of woven root fibre, dampened to keep the warmth in. The bowl was heavy with life that weighed almost nothing. 2 seraphal firebellies lay within it, curled together, their bellies glowing softly. They did not thrash or try to climb the weave, they just watched. A rootkin held the bowl out and spoke the customary 2 words. "Sprites, take." Tyd took the bowl and felt the sprites warm through the weave. He looked down at them and felt their presence. He did not imagine chains, which would perhaps have been easier. He imagined instead the shape of a life that had never needed chains because it had never learned to want anything. He carried the bowl to the trough and set it down, and their eyes followed his hands. He warmed and stirred the sap until it was firm enough to hold shape, but soft enough to accept incorporation. It was not like clay. It needed to remember what it was asked to do. He spoke to himself as he worked, still needing to prove that his mouth belonged to him and him alone. "You'll be warm," and the words were for the sprites, even though they did not understand them as words. "You'll be steady and protected." Protected. Another word that could mean care or confinement, depending on who did the protecting. He reached into the bowl and lifted the smaller sprite, its body warm and its skin mottled. Its tiny limbs flexed and then settled. It did not resist his hand or cling to the bowl. It simply accepted him as the next surface it would inhabit. Holding it above the mould, Tyd watched the surface respond, rising slightly in anticipation of the contact. Then he lowered the sprite until its tail touched, and the sap welcomed it, yielding and cupping the tiny body. Next it began to rise around it and closing the firebelly in its new home. Kid's hands moved quickly to seal the sphere, smooth the join, and warm the surface with his palms until it was flawless. The orb brightened in his hands, the sprite's belly glow now amplified, and the light spread through the workshop in a steady wash that made every edge sharper. He set the finished orb into a wall hollow and watched it rise and hover, checking that it would behave as required. The second sprite watched him from the bowl attentively. In the Skog's chamber, the sprites moved with varying degrees of urgency, their bellies flaring brighter when fed. The Skogs tended them with blunt care, Hands thick and gentle, yet proud of the warmth they maintained. There was life there that chose where to rest and responded to sound, scent, and small disturbances. Tyd had visited often in recent days, telling himself it was oversight and protection. He had watched the brood and felt relief that they seemed healthy, followed by disgust that health was the only word he had for it. He went there again after finishing the first light, unable to stop himself. The chamber lay deeper than his workshop, warmer and damper. The sap-lights floated low and their glow caught on the Skog's rounded shoulders as they moved. The Skogs did not greet him heartily, they just nodded and grunted and returned to their tending. Tyd's presence was unremarkable to them. Sprites skittered along the root fibre nests, their bellies flashing softly. They were not afraid of Tyd or anything, really. They were simply present, at that moment alive in the way a creature was alive when it had room to change. One of the Skogs waddled toward him, holding a small bundle of root fibre containing 2 sprites curled together, warm and glowing. "Good," the Skog said. Tyd nodded. "Good. Tyd tired?" Tyd wanted to laugh at how close that simple word came to truth. He wanted to correct it with a more precise one, ashamed, perhaps. "I'm fine," he said, and the lie sounded familiar. The Skog's heavy hand patted its own chest, then gestured towards the sprites. "Warm. Safe." He nodded again because it was easier than speaking. The Skog waddled away, and Tyd remained standing among the warmth and life, watching sprites that still had the luxury of movement. He returned to his workshop and made the second light. Then another the following day. The work began to settle into rhythm again, which could feel dangerously like peace to Tyd. At night he dreamed of corridors lit with orbs that adjusted their fight as he passed. In the dream he could feel their awareness pressing against his mind, a multitude of small, warm presences. It was not like the demon that once controlled him. They did not shove, claw, or speak any filth. He would wake with his heart pounding, and his mind invaded by unease and foreboding. It would fade quickly, leaving him alone with just the sap-lights drifting in the air. Reich duly returned. He entered the workshop silently, and Tyd noticed him, but he kept his hands moving, stirring and measuring. He did not acknowledge Reich or give him the satisfaction of having Tyd come to attention. But Reich's voice came. "Teach them." "You want the Skogs to do it," he said. "They already breed them," Reich replied. "They keep them warm and healthy. They can be instructed." Tyd wiped his hands with the cloth. He looked at Reich and saw no cruelty or impatience, only the calm of a man who served a structure that could not afford sentiment. "They don't know what this is," Tyd said. Reich looked to the shelf where the finished orbs hovered. "They know what is required of them." "That's not knowledge, though, is it?" Tyd said. "Theirs is blind compliance. Compliance keeps this place together, and you waver." This was the Yewdeep speaking through him, the same way the demon had once spoken through Tyd, only justified by necessity rather than appetite. Tyd's hands curled into fists and then forced themselves open. He did not want to say what terrified him. He had spent 10 seasons building a life where the fear did not have to be spoken, but the system had a way of pressing until what you refused to confront became the only thing left. "If I teach them, they'll make more, faster." "Yes," Reich replied. "And if I don't, you'll find another way?" "The work will continue." There was no threat in Reich's voice, only inevitability. That was what made it unbearable for Tyd. He thought of the way he had refined his formulas, making the lights last longer and making the sprites more stable, less prone to flickering and variance. He had told himself he was protecting and optimizing them, but in reality he had been doing what had once been done to him, only with gentler hands. Reich's voice came again. "You can maintain them and keep them healthy." Tyd did not trust himself to answer or accept the small mercy in that statement. Reich waited, and in the waiting Tyd felt the Yew, patient and indifferent. He lifted one of the finished sap-lights from the shelf and held it close, feeling its warmth, and the sprite within it watched him. Then he understood that the tragedy was not that the sprite was suffering. The tragedy was that it did not know what it had lost because it had never been allowed to imagine it. No hunger, longing, or rebellion, just function, so complete it felt like contentment. Tyd looked at Reich and struggled to remain steady. "Give me one more day." Reich granted the courtesy, knowing that it would change nothing. "One," he said. He turned and left, leaving Tyd standing where he was. He did not sit or meditate. He worked because his hands needed movement and his mind could not bear the stillness. He reached for the last sprite in the bowl, lifted it gently, and felt the trust in its warmth. He set the completed orb on the shelf beside the others and watched it hover without drifting, already obedient, while outside his workshop, sap-lights drifted through corridors grown for watching, each one a small warm eye that did not know what seeing had replaced. Tyd learned that harm does not always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it comes as order and safety, as a system that works too well. And when usefulness replaces freedom, the loss goes unnoticed, until it becomes permanent.